Good afternoon. I am Jason Canales, a member of the Federal Bar Council's Diversity Committee and President-elect of the Puerto Rican Bar Association. On behalf of Sharon L. Nellis, President of the Federal Bar Council, and Angelique Moreno, President of the Puerto Rican Bar Association, I welcome you all to today's program. Who or what is Latino, Hispanic? A Hispanic Heritage Month conversation with Professor Hector Tobar, author of Our Migrant Souls. If you aren't already a member of the Council or the Puerto Rican Bar Association, I encourage you to join. The Council provides an opportunity to grow and amplify your professional network, meet with judges in professional and social settings, and to exchange views and to perform services for the courts of the Second Circuit and the legal community. If you have any questions about the Council, please contact Asia Stevens, Executive Director of the Council. Her email address can be found on the Federal Bar Council contact page. The Puerto Rican Bar Association is one of the oldest affinity bar associations in New York, whose members are committed to meeting the new challenges confronting Latino lawyers in the legal profession and the many issues affecting the Latino community and New York State as a whole. For more information about the PRBA and to become a member, please visit www.prbany.com. I would now like to introduce the moderator of this conversation, the Honorable Edgardo Ramos of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Judge Ramos is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School. Most relevant today, however, is that Judge Ramos is a fellow Puerto Rican, born on the island in the beautiful city of Ponce. Before taking the bench, Judge Ramos served the Hispanic community by, among other things, sitting on the governing boards of the Hispanic National Bar Association and the Puerto Rican Bar Association. He was also a member of the Board of Directors of Aspira of New York, Inc. Please join me in welcoming Judge Ramos.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my extraordinary honor to introduce Professor Hector Tobar, who has graciously agreed to meet with us this afternoon. Professor Tobar is a Los Angeles-born author of 6 books, including the novels The Tattooed Soldier, The Barbarian Nurseries, and The Last Grade Road Ball. His nonfiction, Deep Down Dark, The Untold Stories of 33 Men Buried in a Chilean Mine, and the Miracle That Set Them Free, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a New York Times bestseller. It was adapted into the film The 33, starring Antonio Banderas. His books have been translated into 15 languages. The Barbarian Nurseries was a New York Times notable book and won the California Book Award for the California Book Award Gold Medal for Fiction. Professor Tobar's fiction has also appeared in Best American Short Stories. He earned his MFA in fiction from the University of California, Irvine, where he is currently a professor. As a journalist, he was the Los Angeles Times bureau chief in Buenos Aires and Mexico City. Professor Tobar has also been an op-ed writer for the New York Times and a contributor to the New Yorker, Harper's, Smithsonian, and National Geographic. In 2020, he received a Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard University. And in 2023, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship in Fiction. He is the son of Guatemalan immigrants. His most recent book, Our Migrant Souls, a meditation on race and the meaning of myths and Latinos. Please go out and buy it if you haven't already. Has been widely praised. Bookpage calls Our Migrant Souls one of the most important pieces of Latino nonfiction in several decades. The New York Times calls Our Migrant Souls a resonant and deeply affecting book, and Publishers Weekly calls it lyrical and uncompromising. Professor Tobar, welcome and thank you for your time this afternoon. So let me begin by asking, what impelled you to write this book at this moment in time?
Well, first of all, thank you to the Bar Council and to everyone involved in bringing me here before you. It's one of the great honors of my career to speak to people who've dedicated their lives to the law and to what the law represents in our culture. So the book is born really of 2 things: of my being a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and teaching a lot of large classes about Chicano Latino history and about race. And seeing and reading so many student stories and hearing so many student stories in my office about what it means to be Latino, Mexican, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Guatemalan, Venezuelan, in the United States today. And then, in 2020, the country has this, we're in a pandemic, the country has a national discussion about race because of George Floyd. There is this sudden awareness among many people about the weight of African-American history and of discrimination and white supremacy on this country and its people. But I wasn't seeing the same sort of discussion about Latinidad and Latino people and our brownness and how our brownness fits within the race ideas of this country, the way people see us, the things that people believe about us, what we represent. And so I wanted to do that, and at the same time indulge my love of American history, of United States and Latin American history, which to me are woven together. They're really the same story, as many of you of Puerto Rican descent and other Latinidades know so well, the way our stories are woven together into one. So those were the motivations for wanting to write the book.
Now, the book is both vast in scope. You literally write about situations going back centuries, and intimate in the telling, as you discuss the effects of the really grand sweep of history through individual stories.
Mm-hmm.
And at least from my perspective, it worked really well. And why do you think it worked?
Well, I think that when you're a writer, you have to have a lot of respect for your audience. You have to have a lot of respect for the readers. So to me, my ideal reader is someone who loves to read, but also is very curious, loves language and loves history, and loves to have a story unwound for them. So to me, I just indulge my curiosities. I can't tell you how excited I am to be speaking to a virtual room of lawyers, because to me, the law is like the ultimate story, and the way the law has been shaped, and the struggles and the people and sometimes the stupidities that have come to make the law what it is. Are tremendous to me. And so I've just tried to communicate this lifelong love and passion, because I've been writing about the United States and about Latino people, about immigrants, about people of color, about African American history for 30 years. And so it's wonderful to be able to sort of condense all of that down into one volume, of like a dozen or so chapters that tell the story of my own mental and physical journey through the United States and through Latinidad.
Yeah, it seems like there were a lot of things in here that you wanted to talk about. And as I was reading the book, I got the sense that this could have been a multi-volume, many thousands of pages book. And I thought that because you come at your subject from a variety of not only different academic disciplines, but also different cultural reference points. So for example, many of the paragraphs within even particular paragraphs include references not only to history, ethnography, and geography, but also to Hollywood, science fiction literature, and anime. Why was it important for you to incorporate all of those different analytical lenses?
Well, because all of those different things you mentioned, they together assemble our idea of what our identity is as a quote unquote people. What does it mean to be Latino? Well, you get messages from television, you get messages from film, you get messages from all these different places. What you learn in school. And so I think it's important, if you're going to, and all of those things add up to how we feel about ourselves and how we relate as a community and how we relate to other people. So to me, it was absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary to adopt this approach of totality, right? Let me understand the totality of these relationships. And it has become so much more complex and so much more interesting in the last 10 or 15 years or so, because we've had this revolution of gender thinking, where people have come to realize that gender is a spectrum, that these binaries that supposedly define the human existence really are artificial. And that revolution in thinking, queer studies, gender studies, has really influenced me later in my life. I have a daughter who came out when she was 15 years old, and who is since now she's in college, a really deep student of gay and lesbian history, of LGBTQ history, and all of that has taught me a lot. And so I think all of these issues, all of these ways of thinking are interwoven, and it's really wonderful to sort of try to make them into one song, which is what the book is attempted to do.
Now, the prologue of your book is almost, as I read it, like a letter to your students.
Absolutely.
Writing about their experiences, struggles, triumphs, and that of their parents animates the entirety of the book. Was this book written for them and young Latinos in particular?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when you get to a certain age, you want to pass on what you know. And I think that was exactly the spirit that informed the model for the opening chapter there, which was James Baldwin's incredible essay, which I think should be required reading for every American, The Fire Next Time. So The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin wrote in the 1960s, in a time of a lot of strife and violence. There was a lot of violence against the civil rights movement. And James Baldwin is telling his young nephew, what race means and how people see him and how to maintain your sense of dignity in this world with so much discrimination and hatred and ignorance. And so this is my attempt, to pass on something to this generation of young Latino people, all of them actually the ages of my kids. My kids are teenagers and grown-ups and adults, and just wanting to pass on what we've learned, and not only that, but pass on this strength, which I think is what lots of Latino parents and teachers aim to do. How do we pass on the lessons learned from our experience and our culture on to the next generation? And they're hungry for that. They're already doing that on their own. I'm just attempting to sort of give context and maybe a little bit sense of focus to those efforts.
Now, in terms of passing on what you know, I recall in my own experience, I was born in Puerto Rico, but raised in post-1967 riots, Newark, New Jersey.
Wow.
So my family moved into Newark, New Jersey in November of 1967, right after the riots had happened that summer. So white flight had taken place immediately, and I was frequently the only non-Black student in my classes as a second grader, third grader, et cetera. And I recall, for whatever circumstance in history, that a lot of my teachers were very forward thinking. And so even as a third grader, fourth grader, there were posters of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Angela Davis when she was with the Black Panthers on the walls of my classrooms. Did you have a similar experience in your schooling?
Yeah, I had, I think we're approximately the same generation, because I had exactly the same experience on the West Coast. I went to the public schools of Los Angeles and later of suburban Los Angeles. And I think one of the things that we're very fortunate is that we caught the beginning of the movement to bring African-American history into the schools, which is a movement that goes back to the 1930s. I remember hearing a talk at Harvard when I was a fellow there from a scholar who had examined the origins of African-American History Month, a certain educator in the Deep South who began African-American Black History Week. And so by the time that you and I were in school, those efforts had filtered down into so many public schools. And so we were exposed to this. We were also a generation that grew up in the immediate aftermath. I was 5 years old when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And so we grew up in the immediate aftermath of this incredible drama and trauma in American society over race and the violence that had been inflicted upon the civil rights movement. So I think that taught us a kind of practice. And this is and I write about this in my book, the great gift of African-American struggle and the way it's passed on that gifts to communities that are in many ways younger and have had less chance to sort of shape the institutions of this country. So as you all know, African-American struggle has shaped this country's jurisprudence in the beginning in ways in which the reaction against it, right? The Dred Scott decision, so forth, later the Reconstruction Amendments, much later the Civil Rights Act. African-American struggle has shaped this country's laws, and we're the inheritors of that. And it's also we're the inheritors in our time of this practice of taking history, we learned something from them. We learned that history is a source of strength that it can be brought into the schools. And that to me was absolutely a transformative experience, and it taught me a way of thinking that I've carried on the rest of my life.
Now, you mentioned the assassination of Martin Luther King. You have an interesting connection to that.
That's
and
right.
It's fascinating, I think, for those of us who haven't read the book. Talk about that if you would.
Yes, I grew up in East Hollywood, California, near the corner of Hollywood and Western, if those of you who know Los Angeles. And my family was, a neighborhood that was transient and also incredibly multi-ethnic, lots of Filipino and Thai and Armenian neighbors. It's now called actually Little Armenia. But unbeknownst to me as a kid, right across our backyard fence lived James Earl Ray, who was the assassin of Martin Luther King. And in fact, he lived there for a few months in this apartment building right behind our house at the time that he was planning to assassinate Martin Luther King. And he left in his white Ford Mustang from that neighborhood, which he got fixed at a shop on Hollywood Boulevard down the street from where we lived, to go to the South to seek out, and he stalked King for several weeks, I think. And so, yes, I realized later in life when I read an account of the King assassination by this great attorney, Gerald Posner, who wrote Killing the Dream. I realized that that James Earl Ray, the assassin, had lived next to us. But I also had this story growing up of my godfather. My godfather is African-American, and he was this Black man who had been fleeing Memphis because he had been an NAACP activist protesting the segregation of the public libraries. He'd been arrested, threatened. His mother put him on a bus to Los Angeles. He met my mother in the hallway of the tenement building where my parents lived, gave her a ride to the hospital when she was pregnant, became my godfather. So my life at a very early age was intertwined with this, white supremacist and this African-American activist. And I think that, that all of us as Latino people, we find our stories are deposited inside. And this, of course, is so true of New Yorkers, right? That your story and people from, New York and New Jersey is your story is intersected with all of this African-American and history of race struggle in our country.
Now, let me ask you a little bit more about your background, if I could. Now, I, as Jason mentioned, went to Yale College. I was a smart enough kid, but I was also bright enough to know that I would not have gotten in but for affirmative action policies, and in particular, the struggles that Latino predecessors at Yale went through, sometimes sacrificing even their own undergraduate careers to make institutions like Yale start recruiting in the inner cities and start looking at different aspects of what may constitute success. And as a result, my college experience was one where I was surrounded by not only African-American and Asian and Puerto Rican and Chicano, and we'll get back to that word in a minute, individuals who had a very strong sense of struggle and liberation and really pushing all of us forward so that we can be useful to our families and to our communities. Did you have a similar college experience?
Oh, absolutely. In a much different university. I was at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is, for those of you who don't know, is this beautiful campus on the coastline of Santa Cruz, overlooking the ocean in the woods, in the redwoods. And that university, the University of California, integrated and also, with this mission to make a great university education affordable, available to anybody in the state who had the grades to qualify. And so we were at this university that had a commitment to diversity. Didn't have that many Latino students, but we all banded together, and I met all these great Chicano students who, my experience was, the first time getting high, was with my Chicano friends from Los Angeles who took me in under their arm. First time, a keg party was with my Chicano friends, and also just an introduction to their sense of, pride and their attitude, which was one of we don't really care what anybody really thinks of us. We're here to study, and we're not intimidated because we're Chicano. And that pride, was something that I had not really seen before. I mean, I grew up very proud of being Guatemalteco, but I wasn't a very confrontational person. And yet to meet people who were unafraid of confrontation, that was refreshing. And just to be, and I knew, and also the university I arrived, in 1980 university, all the feminists and all the radicals from the 60s were just getting tenure. And so, just being, I arrived as a pre-med student, and I ended up becoming, studying radical, social theories of radical social change. That became my major. I was a sociology and Latin American studies major. I switched. And so, it was a transformative experience to be in that milieu. Absolutely.
Now, there are a lot of large themes in your book. One, obviously, many of them involving Latino identity. So let me start with that. Mm-hmm. Hispanic versus Latino versus Latinx versus Latine versus Puerto Rican versus Mexican American versus Chicano. Do you have a preference as to any of those? As to how do you refer to yourself as?
Well, it really depends what the what the audience is. I think that I've come to realize that the best thing about those labels is their attempt to express an alliance, right? So you're of Puerto Rican descent and I'm of Guatemalan descent. We're here together in a Latino or Latinx event. And so other than this alliance, the term is so huge as to be meaningless in many ways. So to me, it's the terms are poor substitutes. They're crude ways of describing something that's very rich. So the Puerto Rican and the Guatemalan and the Venezuelan experience have so many different things that are different from each other, but also common threads. Especially now when you think of the Venezuelan migration experience, to me, it's so similar to what happened to Guatemaltecos, 20 years ago. But the terms itself are problematic because look at Latino, which is kind of cool sounding, and except for the gender problem with it, which is why Latinx was invented. Latino implies that we all have this shared European heritage. That's what the name implies. Right. It's an invention of the 19th century of the attempts of French, intellectuals to convince the people in Latin America that they had more in common with the French imperialists than with the American U.S. imperialists. It's a very long and complicated history. But the term Latin erases the parts of us that are indigenous and African, and so it privileges the European. So all of them are problematic. They sort of miss many things. But they are useful in the sense that it's an expression of our attempt to work together and to realize that we do have shared experiences, right? We do have these stories in our past that are very similar, and more importantly, our relationship to power in this country is often very similar.
Now you said that the word sort of helps foster an alliance. Does it sometimes work in the opposite direction? And what I mean by that is that, in my experience, there have been long-standing debates, between, I'll call them, for lack of a better word, conservative Latinos versus liberal Latinos, and the conservatives want to be known as Hispanic, and the liberals want to be known as Latino. Or in the Mexican American community, there are some that don't want to be known as Chicano and want to be known as Mexican American. Do you think that those discussions are helpful?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that it is, to me, the modern definition of Latinidad is something so tied up with migration and the way in which United States migration policy has shaped attitudes about us, and with the existence of such a huge undocumented population, that it's hard to separate the politics of it. How much it's difficult for me to see the Latinidad of Ted Cruz. I just, I know it exists. I know Ted is not his real name. And I know we have something in common, And also, look, I mean, this is a story where in Latin American countries, there are also many conservative and sometimes ultra conservative and dictatorial and fascistic, Latinos in our past. Those, it's, I think, yes, arriving at a common ground on Latinidad is almost impossible when you see these, very, very different ideological, separations. On the other hand, I've interviewed Trump voters who are, or Trump supporters who are very, very Mexicano, very, almost recently arrived. I interview in my book very briefly a man from Idaho who is a Trump supporter, even though he still doesn't have full residency, in the United States, because his friends in Idaho have convinced him that Joe Biden is going to take away all of our jobs and everything. And so I think that, that the politics are this, one more element in this crazy story of Latinidad. And yes, there are great divisions and great, there are many conservative. There's a handful of very conservative people in my book, and they're they're dealing with Latinidad it's a very complicated thing.
Now, like you, I am fortunate to be able to work with very young people, very young lawyers on a regular basis, and they, at least the ones in my life, are constantly having these discussions and constantly pushing me to start using more recent
Yes.
applications, in my opinions. Do your students have those discussions as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, it's important to realize that, ethnic terms and race terms are constantly shifting what they mean. And it's a historical, this is something that's occurred throughout history. I mean, I'm standing here in Los Angeles, and at the beginning, a century ago, a century ago or 2 centuries ago, I would have called myself a Californio, because California was this ethnic identity that existed. So Californios were these people who were very often of African and indigenous descent, and they come to Los Angeles and they want to reject the terms. They want to leave behind the baggage of negro and indio and even mestizo and and all these different terms. Mulatto, they want to leave those terms behind, and so they create a new ethnicity, which is Californio. Now, no one calls himself California anymore; it's died away. But in its time, it was the cool new appellation, and that is still happening. People are taking this term Latino. They have now a new awareness of gender and of the mysteries and the lies of gender identity. And so that has led them to want to strip away the O and make it an X. And I think that, and there's just labels, like the newest one that I've heard is there a lot of, as a lot of us are self-conscious of our Spanish. A lot of us don't speak Spanish. And so there's a new appellation in the school where I work, where people call themselves, we're no Sabo kids. They take sort of pride in the fact that, or they're going to be a little bit more in your face about the fact that they don't speak Spanish that well or not at all. And yet they still consider themselves Latino. And so, I have students who call themselves Blaxican. That's increasingly common appellation in California, especially because they're a mixture of this Black and Mexican families. And so they will always be shifting, and they will always be inventing new ones. Chicano used to be a term of disrespect, and then it became a term of pride. And, so all of them are always shifting.
Now, you write in your book that Latino is the most open-ended and loosely defined of the non-white categories in the United States. As such, it can feel like the transit lounge of American identities, one where people come and go with relative ease. Now, what do you think of the changes over the years in the U.S. Census, which no longer counts Latino as a race?
Right. Well, actually, only once was something like Latino counted as a race, which was in the 1930 census, where Mexican became a race. Right. Now, this is at a time when there was a lot of migration from Mexico. Then, after the Mexican Revolution, the decades of the 1910s and 20s, there was a massive amount of migration to the west, especially the Southwest. And so that actually kind of reveals what race is. So the idea of Mexican as a race is invented to explain that there are these people among us who are different and they have a different way of being. That's why Black is created. You know, that's why all the major race categories, and Latino is now a de facto race category, because if you look at, for example, you know, when there's some story about demographics and they show a pie chart of the United States, even though Latino is not supposed to be a race, they make it into one by putting it alongside white, Black, Native American, and Asian, right? And so all of these categories are essentially they don't really have anything to do with our biology. They really are attempts to explain where that group of people fits in the American story, right? And so now this is something where, like, Latino people, it's like, wait, we fit in this story in a certain way. So there are certain Latino people who are assertive about that, who say we should be counted as a race category because they think of race in the term of resistance, right? Which is what happened with the African American story. You know, the original slaves brought to this country did not think of themselves as African. They thought of themselves as members of the various nations to which they belong. They become Black because they're made into Black by white people, right? And then Black becomes this term of resistance, right? Which has evolved, in this identity, which has resolved, resisting racism. And so a lot of Latino people is like, hey, we deserve to be counted as a race, but, you know, and effectively we are. You know, we are treated as a race. You know, suspects are described in the United States as Black, Hispanic, Asian, white, or, you know, Hispanic. Hispanic is a de facto kind of race in this country. Now, whether or not we're, you know, counted in the census that way, well, we have the box marked Latino to mark, which is supposed to be this, like, you know, Hispanic, Hispanic descent or not. And that's a whole, you know, it's so the confusion and all the sort of different categories reflect the chaos of American history.
You talk in your book at various points about efforts on the part of our communities, or the fact that our communities sort of adopted that effort from the top to separate us, count us as different, and therefore as lesser, and how some of us, by virtue of the amount of, you know, melanin in our skin, sort of tried to get out of that category. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're putting it in a very polite way. Yeah, there's a lot of people who are ashamed of their brownness, and
that's what I said.
White, and become white. You know, and in fact, that's the thing. You know, you talked about Latino, right? And I write about it as the transit lounge, because Latino is like, you were like on the cusp of whiteness at one point. We were, right? And that's still, you know, and in fact, on the census, you can mark Latino, and then mark race, you can mark white. And the number of people doing that has declined. Part of that is because of the way the question is asked now. But anyways, and so we're people who we're supposed to have been the next group to merge into whiteness, the way the Italians did, or the Greeks, or the Jews. You know, think about being Jewish and what it has meant historically in Europe, the anti-Semitism, where Jewish people have been treated as a race. The Nazis referred to the Jews as a race. The Spanish, during the Inquisition, invented the idea of Jewishness as a race passed down through the blood, as a biological construct, because of the threat that Jewish people and Jewish descended people presented to them in their thought in Spanish society, right? So, and so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, but yeah, so these identities are shifting all the time. What was your original question? I'm sorry, I got lost in Spain.
The fact that many in our community.
Oh, right. Yes. And so, yeah, and now, right. And so among us, we were supposed to assimilate into whiteness, right? And a lot of, and there's this incredible colorism in our community, a word that I didn't even really know until I became a university professor, because it's a word that explains the fact that you have ignorant relatives who think that if you're lighter skinned, you're smarter or prettier than if you're darker skinned. And so that is this incredibly, powerful thing in our community, this desire to merge into whiteness. That is, and the only reason we haven't completely, the only reason why this idea of Latino people as a separate kind of race, de facto race, is because of immigration, and because of the fact that we have been racialized into a threat because of immigration. Right? There's 11 million at least, if not more, undocumented people in this country, and they've been transformed in a certain kind of rhetoric into a danger, a menace, cartel operatives, barbarians, ignorant people, welfare people trying to scam out welfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that racial rhetoric is preventing us from assimilating. I mean, if we wanted to, assimilating into whiteness. And then there's the other part of it, which is that in the face of the decline of whiteness as a desirable thing, a lot of people are now holding on to their Latinidad and saying, no, I'm not white. You can be a very light-skinned. I know tons of stories, and I'm sure you do too, of light-skinned Latino people who've been insulted that they've been called white. So it works, there's this. So I say in my book that our relationship to whiteness is both the tragedy and the comedy of us. The tragedy, Puerto Rican soldiers in World War II being, if they were darker, being labeled as black and not being allowed to serve with white soldiers, whereas the lighter Puerto Rican soldiers were in integrated units, and so forth and so on.
Now, my sense, because is that issue is not getting better. I mean, there are references, and I know that there's a very famous Puerto Rican work, I think a dramatic work, where there's a line, "Y tu abuela, dónde está?" Which refers to like a family that wants to present as white, despite the fact that the abuela is una mulata, that they're hiding so that the world doesn't see exactly where they come from. So it has been a theme, and there's famous books and there's famous examples of individuals who have lived their lives as white, and turns out that close to their death or after their death, they turn out to have been not white. First of all, do you agree that it doesn't seem to be getting any better? And by the way, and let me also inject into this question. In your book, you write about your children and about the fact that they have brought home non-Latino partners.
Yes.
So we would think that it would be getting better, but I don't see it. Do you?
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic, because I think that having been exposed to so many intimate tales of a younger generation, I think I've come to see how much intermarriage and interracial relationships are kind of reshaping, people's ideas about race and skin color. I think that now more than ever, there's a cachet with the notion of being a person of color. There's a certain coolness and power that comes with it. And if you think about the music that a lot of young Latino people listen to, and you think about reggaeton, and it's incredibly, reggaeton is this, it's the quantum physics of popular music, because it has so many different kinds of influences in it. Well, of course, most popular music does. So I see a lot of curiosity and a lot of openness about race among a younger generation. I think that the politics of it is scary, because that's where you see, I think, a lot of resistance. You see a lot of people treating Latino identity and people who are assertive about it as a threat. That's why we have all these book bannings occurring all over the country. That is not getting better. That is absolutely, you're right. That's absolutely getting worse. But I think in our intimate spaces, the civil rights movement and the abolition of, de jure forms of racism, the abolition of the bans against interracial marriages, among other things, or of officially sanctioned segregation. We're now 50 years, removed from that. And those 50 years, in our intimate spaces have done a lot to change the way we think about ourselves and in our, in our families. So I think, it's the constant tension. I think there's this tension between the forces that are trying to pull us apart and those that see, as I write about, the fact when you live and you work with someone, you begin to see the absurdity of race ideas.
Now, let me admit to you that you taught me something about a Supreme Court case in your book that I did not know.
Oh, okay.
And it's the Mendez case, the Mendez desegregation case
Yes.
of California, which was a precursor to Brown v. Board of Ed. And what you say in your book is that, and Mendez was a Mexican-American family in California that wanted to get their children into the white schools, into
Right.
non-segregated schools. And I believe that you wrote that the argument that they made on behalf of the Mendez children was
Yes.
that they shouldn't be in the segregated schools because they're white. So they should be in the
Absolutely.
white schools. And
Absolutely.
I was aware of the case. I wasn't aware of that aspect of it.
Yeah, that shocked me when I read about it, because and that actually was the tension of that time, 1940s and 50s, in the United States, 1930s, 40s, and 50s, where it was that there was a segment of the, Mexican-American civil rights movement that asserted, look, you are treating us like Black people and we're not Black, we're white like you. And so, ultimately that case, Mendez v. Westminster, was decided on other grounds. But that was the initial argument. One of the initial arguments was that you were unfairly, categorizing these Mexican students as Black. So yes, once again, it's that push and pull of Latinidad within this, white-Black dynamic.
Now, another of the major themes, I think, in your book is the concept that so many of us have one foot in the United States and one foot in our home country or parents' home country. And you talk about the experiences that you had and the importance to your personal development of going back to Guatemala and seeing the places where your parents grew up, seeing your relatives there. And you mentioned earlier about the No Sabos folks. First of all, do you encourage your students to, first of all, to learn Spanish if they're not fluent in Spanish?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that for me, my relationship to Spanish is similar to that of a lot of kids growing up. My father insisted that I speak to him in Spanish. My parents were divorced when I was 8, but every weekend when I went to go visit my father, Papa, I'd have to talk to him in Spanish. And over the years, my Spanish became weaker and weaker because I wasn't being educated in it. So by the time I became a college student, my Spanish was just at a 4th grade level. And I went to college. I studied Spanish. I studied Spanish grammar for the first time, wrote my first letters in Spanish, read my first Spanish novel, and it was just this incredibly transformative experience because then I could go back to Guatemala and I could actually have an adult conversation with my grandparents and with other family members. And I learned so much about myself through that. So I think that learning another language is always a great idea. And being, able to take that journey to Latin America, a lot of people in this country cannot do that because they're undocumented. Mm-hmm. And so it's a privilege to be able to do so. And if you can, yes, absolutely encourage it. It is, language requires work. It requires work to keep a language alive. It's not just something that snaps in our brains because we're born Latino, like we can, it's like salsa dancing or anything else. It takes a little bit of practice, sometimes a lesson to be able to do it. Right. So, yeah, I totally encourage it. It transformed my life. I mean, I did education abroad. I did a year in Mexico City when I was a teenager still and college student. And it just opened up a world to me. And every job I've ever had since too is in one way or another, use Spanish in it. So I absolutely encourage my students. At the same time, I want to tell students, don't feel embarrassed. It's almost like it's almost like part of the description of what a Latino person is in the United States is that they're embarrassed of their Spanish in some way, because really only a few of us, like a very small percentage of people, are like totally perfectly bilingual where you don't even have an accent. That's a really hard, very rare thing to do. And so don't be embarrassed of your Spanish ever.
Yeah, well, your parents appear to have been a lot more successful than my wife and I have been. My wife is one of these Spanish speakers who speaks English and Spanish with absolutely no accent, and we insisted on speaking exclusively in Spanish to our children when they were small. And when they were small, it was fine. But from the moment they started going to school, they really resisted speaking Spanish. And it was eventually it just got to be too much for us to fight against because it wasn't worth the daily struggles, the daily battles. But I will say this: one of our children is very, very regretful that he did not continue to speak Spanish, and now he's trying to catch up as best he can. In fact, he also studied abroad in Cuba. But
Oh, wow.
Regrets that he fought us in the way that he did. Now, let me ask you this: you write about a particular incident in your life that I thought was very interesting. You had been working on an article on illiterate adults,
Oh, right.
and when your father read that article, he went to you and he told you that his mother, your grandmother, was in fact illiterate. And it was curious to me that, first of all, that it was such, and he had never, that's when you first learned. So you
Right.
were already a full grown adult journalist. It was curious to me both that he had never told you and why that happened, and also why it was uh, so seemingly important in your life as well when you learned that.
Yeah, this was something I'd already written 4 books. I mean, I was like an author and writing for the Los Angeles Times. I was a columnist for the Los Angeles Times. And my father didn't tell me because it was a source of shame to him. He was embarrassed. And it was like almost symbolic of the shame that he felt of being poor. So my father's poverty traumatized him in many ways, and the separations in his life when he was very young, the separations caused by the dysfunction of poverty, which many of us have in our past and sometimes in our present. And so that's why he didn't tell me. And I remember him bringing my grandmother's passport. His hand was shaking. He had she was dead by then, but he had a photocopy of her passport. And it had the X where the signature should have been. And some Guatemalan bureaucrat had written, "Ignora firmar," does not know how to sign, And so my father let all this out. He poured it out. And I think that, it just for me was, it just revealed a lot to me. It revealed a lot to me about my father and his value of education. Here's a person who only got to the 6th grade in Guatemala, and then in the United States, as a young man in his 20s, resumed his education at night school in Hollywood to get his high school equivalency and then his AA degree. And he always loved books and loved education. And he inculcated me in this love of books and language. And obviously, it helped influence me becoming a writer when I became an adult myself, and I could think about professions and so and it's just also, I mean, it's such a symbol of our humanity. I think all of us, we collect books. You have yours back there, and I have mine over here, and the books are symbols of the people that we've made ourselves into. It's this. There's so much about Latino identity. There's so much stigma attached with us to the idea that we're not very smart, or that we're not, no somos capaces, and that we're just, no. And there's language about this all throughout Latino history. That we're not gente de razón, right? Is the term that was used during the colonies. To be a person of reason, right? Is what our. And so my father, that was his struggle, and he passed that on to me, and that's why now I've written 6 books, and it was wonderful that he finally shared that with me, and it made so much of my own life clear. And I would say that all of us, I think, have had a moment like that, where if we're lucky, a parent reveals something to us, and our own histories come into focus.
Yeah, I thought it was very poignant the way you discussed your father's thinking along those lines, and the picture, the only picture that you include in the book,
Yes.
which is the picture of you and your mother when you were an infant at the observatory.
Yes, that was my, my mother is such a beautiful young woman. She's 20 years old when she has me, and someone who, oh my God, my mother and her lessons about Guatemala, and she communicated something to me throughout my life, which I think is so important in our families, especially where she told me that I was the product of love. And she communicated the idea that she loved where she was from, and she loved me, and she loved my father, even though he had, betrayed her and they had gotten divorced. Because I think that kind of love, whatever love that we feel in our families, the love that we have for each other and for our communities, that's what gives us faith in times of struggle. When you have to study to pass the bar exam, or you have like a deadline and you have all these challenges facing you, where does your self-belief come from? It's from it's the people who've loved us, who've built us up. And so I owe that to my mother, who's just a wonderfully, creative and bright person.
Now, let me ask you this. A lot of the stories that your students write about seem to me to come from students who are still first and second generation.
Yes.
I'm sure that you must have very many other students whose families have been here 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. What
Yes.
differences, if any, do you see between those two populations?
I think that in practice, they're all thrown together. I think that in the barrios of especially of Los Angeles, you see, multi-generation families next to the recently arrived, just in the same way that a lot of Latino families, when they come to the United States, they move into African-American neighborhoods and they live next to African-American people who obviously have been in the country for multiple dozens of generations, really. Yeah, and I think that Latino identity, oh my God, it's like it's a spectrum. And so many of my barrio students who are many generations in this country, their stories of Latinidad are still stories about struggle against the outside world. Us in the barrio against the outside world and the way they see us. And instead of the border, there's the cops, right? Or there's the journey from your barrio house to like the upscale mall when you get a job there. That journey is like crossing a border.
Yeah.
And it is literally crossing economic and social borders. So I think that there's a lot of commonalities in the experience. The language is different. Sometimes the attitude is different. There's, I think, a lot of optimism, more optimism in those recently arrived stories, right? In the older stories. Oh, but even there is I'm thinking of this one wonderful student who wrote about growing up in the barrios of Ventura, sort of semi-agricultural, and stories that are just about this barrio and how it's evolved, and there are definite differences, but there's also these commonalities.
We have a few minutes. There is a question that one of our
Yes.
listeners is asking, a young lady that I think I recently just met, Hamza.
Yes.
And it reads, this is really fantastic. Thank you for this conversation. I recently came to the obvious realization that Spanish is the language that was imposed on many South and Central American communities by their colonizers. So in one way, it represents how well these communities can assimilate into dominant culture despite the narratives to the contrary about undocumented immigrants. Does this history influence your relationship to Spanish in any way?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. And I think absolutely. The thing is that that for many of us, especially here in the West and the Southwest, and also, oh my God, also a lot of people of Caribbean descent, is that our indigeneity is something hidden from us. And so we know that in our past, we have this violent encounter between indigenous peoples and colonizers. From that violent encounter, many of us have been created, and me being Guatemalteco and going to Guatemala and seeing indigenous culture, a very strong and vibrant and independent indigenous culture that still exists in Guatemala, and learning about the way that culture has evolved and the challenges indigenous people face today. Yes, I think that's something that so many young Latino, Latinx, Hispanic people long to understand about themselves. Part of the fascination with Frida Kahlo is that Frida Kahlo was someone who you'll recall, dressed in these indigenous dresses, and it's not completely cultural appropriation because she is of Oaxacan descent. There's this wonderful picture which I saw in a museum in New York, I think in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Art Museum, when they had their Frida Kahlo exhibit of Frida's mother as a young girl, 19th century, sitting with all these relatives from Oaxaca, and she's dressed in this traditional sort of huipil, embroidered indigenous dress of Oaxaca, because her family was mestizo, a mixed family, and they were celebrating their indigenous heritage. She was very lucky to have that, and that she ended up sort of adopting it as a style, as an attitude for the rest of her life. And a lot of Latino people long for that, to understand what part is there a spiritual part of me that I can, that is, still kind of memory in my brain from the indigenous people who are my ancestors, because all of that was systematically erased. Like if you think most Mexican, Guatemalan people, we have Spanish surnames, Tobar, Perez, whatever, Hernandez. And yet, half of our DNA is indigenous. So why don't we have half of us have, indigenous surnames like Sunkash or whatever, the indigenous? We don't, because there has been this shame and it's been systematically erased. And so that part of us is something that young people are especially increasingly aware of, and making efforts to preserve or to examine their links to the indigenous cultures of the Americas, the pre-contact, pre-conquest identities of the Americas.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so let me just ask you a couple of questions.
Yes.
Are your students more or less hopeful about their futures than they were before?
Oh, wow. I think that that they're much more in conflict than my generation was, and they're much more anxious. My generation, our generation, I think that we had certain kinds of anxieties about entering into, the dominant culture and becoming successful in all the different professions we decided to. But we have, the economy was growing. Things were like, United States was, in the 1960s and 70s had the fastest rate of economic growth in its history, one of the fastest in its history. And, young people today are not living in those kinds of times. And so I feel a lot of anxiety. But at the same time, I feel like a more mature, they're more mature about it in a way, which is really interesting to me. It's like they have, and it's part of it is thanks to all the debates that are going on in this country, this discussion about race and gender. So younger people are kind of wiser about that just because they were born later, and they can draw upon all of this wisdom. They grow up in an age where any alternative history that they want is accessible to them. I have a daughter who's queer, and she grew up in a household that was very tolerant, but she, did her own exploration of queer history. That she's very, very smart about that stuff that wasn't offered to her in her schools, and she could do that as a teenager, as a middle schooler even. And I think a lot of young people grow up that way. They grow up a little bit wiser and more informed than we did, and that's, to me, and a little bit kind of more astute. And I wish they could, I could also, tell them, alleviate a lot of the hurt that they feel, which is a kind of different hurt, a hurt of seeing family members who are still in undocumented status, or all the discourse about Latinidad in this country, and a lot of the negative, stereotypes, which didn't feel quite as insidious back then as they do now.
And my last question, Professor Tobar, and I think from your book, and in particular the epilogue, I think I know the answer to, but are you more or less hopeful about our future?
Oh, I'm very very hopeful. I'm hopeful. I'm not really hopeful about the prospect of immigration reform, but I think that we will see ourselves through a century of struggle for immigration reform, much like the century between Reconstruction and the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments and the passage of the Civil Rights Act 100 years later. That's 100 years of Jim Crow, right? That the African-American community suffered through. And of course, there's still so much work to do for African-American civil rights, but it was a century for this, for the de facto citizenship for African-American people to have de facto citizenship, right? And so I think I see us as having just begun that century of struggle. But I'm very hopeful in terms of the open-mindedness that I see among a young of law, because that to me, open-mindedness and also having the sort of critical lens is a great source of strength for a person as they navigate through their lives, as they both have professions and build families. Those two things together are very powerful, and to have and to hold on to the sense of ourselves as travelers through history, as migrants. This is something that has helped the Jewish people navigate through crises for millennia. And in a certain way, Latinidad's a little bit like that. It's this idea of holding on to the journey, holding on to yourself as a traveler in a journey. And I think that that I'm optimistic because of that.
Well, Professor Tobar, our hour is up. You have been extraordinarily generous with your time. It was a wonderful book. I do encourage everyone who has not read it to read it. And thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.